Okay, welcome everyone to my talk on the Microsoft Identity Platform. We're just going to dive right in. We'll be talking a lot about this and just spend too much time on the title slide. My name is Patrick Witbrod. I am a software engineer at Valorem Reply and consultant. I've been doing software engineering for about 6 years now and done a lot of work in SharePoint in my past positions and a lot of work with Office 365. I got to use some of the Graph API, and I've done a lot of work recently using uh, Microsoft Identity Platform to authenticate apps for customers. So if I'm not developing, I'm generally going to be outside, not staring at a computer. Not that there's been much of that these past couple months. It's been busy at work and not really busy outside of anything not in my home. So we'll start by talking about why you'd want to use the Microsoft Identity Platform as opposed to doing your own authentication and authorization at the beginning. I like to start with the why of it because there are a lot of solutions out there, and if you are on the fence about whether you want to build your own, whether you want to use Microsoft as your provider, whether you want to use Google as your provider, Facebook, similar, it just makes sense to try and convince you that this is the path to go down before we get too much into the weeds. Today's applications are really complex, and users and our customers who serve those users want a lot of things in it. Things like responsive design and accessibility take a lot of work on the front end to get right. I mean, both front end of a project and front end of the code. A lot of time goes into getting those things right so that applications can be used across every platform and can be used by everyone who wants to use them. Performance is obviously something that's been pushed for quite a while. Low internet places with low internet access, like rural areas, need well-written, high-performant applications. Data and analytics, people like to know what you're doing with their data. Our customers want to know as much as they can about who's using their application, why, what they're doing. They want to really be able to drill into those stats. And then the main topic today is security. There's been a couple recent data breaches in the news, lots of spear phishing going on. But I mean, even outside the election, obviously, but there was even some of that discussion going on there. All of these things are things that are going to take your time away from one of them. You can only do so many of them well, and you can only do so many of them from scratch. There are obviously tools like libraries, component libraries, CSS libraries to help with responsive design. There are tools that can help you audit your accessibility, performance. There's code linting tools to help with that even, as well as load testing. Data and analytics, Microsoft and others have huge platforms that allow you to go through that. And security, there are a couple of those, but you're going to have to pick and choose where you want to be able to spend your time and if you want to get all of these. And they're decisions that are going to affect how much you spend and how much your customers spend on you if you're a consultant. And the end result is going to be how much you want to put on your clients, whether that's an actual cost if you're charging them for the work, whether you're charging them a subscription for something, or if it's just the cost of not having as much of one of these as you'd like, the ability for people to see as well to use your app if you want to sacrifice accessibility, or the ability or not being able to look at things on your phone for your application and sacrifice responsive design. Where you really shouldn't sacrifice is going to be the security and the performance. And security is what we're talking about today with the Microsoft Identity Platform. I really feel like it helps bring your security to the next level with a few easy steps. It's super easy to integrate. Before we get to exactly what those things are, I'm going to talk a little bit about Authentication 101 to bring people up to speed if they don't know. Authentication is when a user proves who they say they are. classic example, username and password. Make sure that you are the person that is going to be logging into this system and that you are supposed to be there. Authorization is once the system knows who you are, what can you do? Are you a super user? Are you an admin? Are you a guest that can only view things? And then other considerations around authentication that we'll touch on, but not get into detail. Single sign-on, being able to use one login for multiple applications in or outside of the same system. Passwordless authentication, things like Windows Hello or the Microsoft Authenticator app, which you might have seen in a couple other sessions today already as people logged in different places. Multi-factor authentication. A lot of companies, most companies require this now. My company requires it. I have apps on my phone to get me keys. I get texts every time I log in somewhere. And it's an extra security step that really needs to be taken. And then application management, being able to know if you're letting an app access your information for a user, you need to know what apps you have and what they can do. That brings us to the Microsoft Identity Platform. It is a set of tools built on top of these open standards, OAuth 2.0, which is a standard spec'd authorization platform that provides bearer tokens and prevents sort of what used to happen where applications would directly log in as a user, kind of like impersonation, where they would read your username and password and send that along, and the application for all intents and purposes would be you. It does not provide encryption. OAuth 2 does not. That's a separate section that you need, and encryption is a whole nother subject. There are companies that have crazy ways to generate encryption and encrypt their data. One that I think is interesting is the CEO has 50 lava lamps on his wall being watched by a camera, and they use machine learning to watch those lava lamps and have it generate the encryption based on the motion of that. Now, that's obviously overkill and not a standard use case, but just the sheer number of ways to do that is incredible and deserves a talk all on its own, but it's not covered as part of OAuth 2.0. And then OpenID Connect, which is the authentication protocol built on top of OAuth. It's how you prove who you are. So it's how the Microsoft Identity Platform figures out that you are the person you say you are, as opposed to some hacker or bad actor that's trying to get to your information. So when it comes down to it, this is about protecting, in our case, it's about protecting our users, our customers' users' information. But on a personal level, it's about protecting my information. I want to make sure that my data is safe, and that's OpenID is a standard for how we decide who that is. And then application management inside your portal using the Microsoft Graph API and PowerShell, so we can automate how we manage what applications we authenticate with. Additionally, there's a bunch of other tools. There's code samples. There's an enormous amount of documentation that I'll show you some towards the end of this talk. But these are the three basic pieces that make the Microsoft Identity Platform work. So here is sort of the basic flow of, this should say OpenID Connect. I will fix that. And OAuth and OAuth 2. They're both sort of in this flow. And this is what the Microsoft Identity Platform manages for you. So you don't have to write this. Yes, you can't see my mouse. Resource owners are users, because what we're talking about here is our data. So the client, whether it's an application we built, if we built a custom application, or even when you're logging into a new instance of Microsoft Teams on a different computer or on a brand new phone, it's going to send an auth request to you, and you will your information, and it's going to communicate with whatever controls that information. It's going to make sure that this client's okay to check, and it's going to make sure that you are who you say you are, whether that's with a password, whether it's with multi-factor identification, passwordless. It's going to check, and then it's going to send back to the client, yeah, this person is who they say they are. Then they're going to send that code back to a different server that has a pre-existing relationship and says, this is who they are. What can they get? Then that's being sent back here, back to the client, and then they pass it along to the resource they're actually looking for. So this is actually the Teams client or the graph endpoints. It's saying, okay, so we've identified who this person is based on our application's pre-existing relationship with then now I know what they can access, so I'm going to use that access token to try and request what I'm looking for, whether that's mail, whether that's my profile picture, or any other data that the resource owner owns. Now they're going to check that you can get it, and if you are allowed to get it, it sends that back, and if not, you get an unauthorized. All this entire flow with very minimal setup is automatically controlled by the Microsoft Identity Platform. There are two methods to do it. There's MSOL and ADAL. ADAL has been deprecated as of this year. So I'm going to talk about MSOL, and there'll be a quick demo with that, with some code here coming up shortly. There we go. How? So we're going to go to the demo, and I'm going to look through a JavaScript single page application. This code is all available in the Microsoft GitHub. It's one of the code samples I was telling you about. I'm going to walk through registering an application inside the Azure portal, inside Azure AD, talk through some of those different options, and then we're going to look at the application and get signed in. I'm going a lot faster than I thought I would. Does anyone have any questions so far? I don't know if anyone else has joined.
I don't think anybody has questions, but Becky and Matt Holt just joined.
Oh, okay,
yep,
great.
I'm good.
Perfect. So here we are in Azure, and I am in my own personal tenant. This is my personal email, my default directory. Azure Active Directory is right up here, but if you do not have it, you can search for Active Directory, and it's just going to be, one of the first things that pops up in a service. There's a default tenant. I'm the global administrator of it, and then we're going to start with app registrations because we're talking about adding the Microsoft Identity Platform to an application. I have one set up already. I'm going to set up a separate one real fast just to walk through that because we have time and it's easy to do. But there's a lot of things that you can set up in here. But we're just going to do a new registration. And this is all you have to do. So you have to give it a name. And then you have to decide what kind of accounts you want to be able to log into your application. If you're doing an internal application that's just for users in a company that uses Active Directory, you'll use the single tenant for this directory that you're in currently, that you're setting up this application in. There's an organizational directory, so any Azure AD directory that's multi-tenant. Then there's even more open, which is what we're going to do, and that's going to be accounts in any organizational directory, so any Azure AD that's out there, and then personal Microsoft accounts for things like Skype and Xbox. This, believe it or not, is a Microsoft account, this at Gmail. I don't actually know how I did that, but I did, and that's what we'll be logging in as, even though it's a Gmail. And then there's personal Microsoft accounts only. It provides the documentation for which to choose right here. And we're actually going to skip the redirect URI for now to go through more of what those are. So you register that. It's creating the application, and it takes you right to it. I'm going to be deleting this after this, so the directory and so the application ID will not exist anymore. In here, there's a lot of things you can do, but the first thing that we want to do is go to the authentication in manage, and we're going to add a platform. So different configurations are needed for different platforms. Out of the box, to help you register your applications, there's web applications and single page applications. We're doing a single page application. It's all JavaScript. So why that matters is in like a single page application, routing isn't handled the traditional way. You're not going to be redirecting back and forth to different pages. You'll want like a pop-up experience, which we'll do. Web ones, that's applications that you deploy to a web server that requires slightly more configuration. Applications, this is available on iOS, Mac, Android applications, as well as the desktop applications. Oh, sorry, clicked on that on accident. There we go. So we're just going to do a single page application, and since I'm only going to be running this locally, and this is going to be where they send that token to that we talked about earlier in the PowerPoint. Whenever you are doing your authentication and you want to prove, once you've proven to the system that you are who you say you are, where are they going to send that back to? That's what this URL is. And then, so MSOL 2.0 does not support implicit grant, so that's something that a method that used to work, but it's not as secure. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but MSOL.js has 2.0 is under general availability. It's fully supported everywhere now, and that's a recent development. That wasn't the case the last time I had to set it up, so that's good. And we're going to ignore this because we don't need to worry about implicit grant, so we're not going to send back access tokens or ID tokens. Hit configure. And that's all we have to do to get login, or excuse me, to set up simple login in an application as far as the Azure setup goes. Now, how do you prove that your application has access to this this directory, and how do you know what to request for your application? That's going to require some setup in the code. And that's what I have open here. So this is the, as I said, the all available in GitHub. This is just sort of an out-of-the-box demo package that we're going to run here in a minute. But there are a few things that you need to do. So there's first the auth config. And that's where you put in your client ID, which is the ID of the application. And I will go back and get that over here in the overview. So this is how you tell your app, this is what ties your application to the application up here in Azure Active Directory. The authority is who you're logging in as. So something that's very cool about the Microsoft Identity Platform, and something that whenever I started into the world of wanting to understand security, I thought was really interesting about even Facebook. Since this flow is open source, your authority can be anything. So this uses the MSOL library, but inside MSOL, there are additional identity providers that you can use. You can use Facebook, you can use Google, and obviously Microsoft, and others. You can make custom identity providers. If you have login set up somewhere else and it uses OAuth and OpenID Connect, or can be set up to do that, you can use it through Microsoft Identity Platform B2C. And I'll show you where that documentation is. But the authority we're going to be using is the login Microsoft Online/common. That's just the most general open one there is. And then we put in our redirect URI so we know where to expect that token. Cache location is a more developer thing. Everything's just sort of going to go to session storage. We don't want to store it long term. You don't want to cache it too long. And then there's the graph config. So we're going to want to get some information from the login. We don't want to just have login and just be like, oh, they proved they said there. There's a use case for that. But if you recall earlier on in the presentation, I talked about one of the whys being data and analytics. Part of that is connectedness. And one of the things that Facebook and Microsoft now with their acquisition of LinkedIn and Google have always done right is tying people to their services through their data. If you can log into a brand new application with a custom username and password, or if you can use single sign-on through Microsoft or Google, it's way easier to click that button and say, yeah, sign me in with Microsoft, because then you have that added security of Microsoft is managing my identity. You don't have to remember another password, which are easy to forget. And you don't have to worry about them storing necessarily your information in their system. If it's a smaller company, a newer app, it's there. And then you get the benefit of they can now pull in your profile picture if they do it right. They can pull in your email address, your home address. If you're going to buy something and you log in with your personal Microsoft or Google account and they have your address, they can pull that from you automatically. That's a better user experience, and they don't have to re-enter information. And the company that's using this, not from the user perspective, but the application, now has access to some of that information that they're granted, and they can see what their users are doing and learn more about them, which helps drive the business. In this case, we're going to also look at mail, and you set these up. There are a lot of different permissions for what endpoints you can set up and call and what permissions you're going to scope to. There are other considerations in here if you want to add different permissions. But in this case, we want them to be granted the user read permission. I probably have to manually add the mail, but we want the Microsoft Graph and we want to view the user's email in this case. And this is where you check those things. So we want to be able to, view the user's email. There's a ton of different API permissions that you can request, and these are going to be sent past the user in a second. I'm going to discard this change for now because I'm not too worried about it. And then for those of you that are curious about the application itself, when you download it from GitHub, you just have to set up these things that I showed you in the auth config. Let me save that. Set up these in the graph config. Run npm install, which is a package. npm is a package manager for JavaScript. So everything you need to run this application is listed in here, and there's not much. There's Azure MSol Browser, Express, and Morgan, which is a way to handle things. I had already installed, so it went pretty fast. You install that, and then to run it locally, npm run start. Now, notice it's listening on port 3000, so this is now going to be running locally on my machine at port 3000. And observant people on the call will recall that that was the redirect URI I set up here in the authentication step. So now my application in the auth config knows to expect a token at localhost 3000. My application that's been set up in Azure knows to send the token to localhost 3000. And my application is running at localhost 3000. Now, again, I apologize. It's a pretty straightforward app, but we're going to sign in. I'm going to sign in with my personal one. And now it's going to talk about my app is unverified because it's right there, but it's going to let me know what permissions I am granting it access to. So I have proven who I said I was by submitting my username and password. Now, Microsoft Identity Platform is telling me that, hey, this application you just proved yourself to wants this information. Is that okay? And then it also gives me a bunch of warnings like, hey, hasn't really provided a lot of information to us. I literally just set it up in front of you. There's no extra security. I don't remember there's no encryption implicit in OAuth. And I don't have like a security cert running on my local host. Are you sure you want to do this? I'm going to say yes. I like to live on the edge. I'll just grant it all my information. And then I can see my profile. Don't have anything in there, but let me sign out.
No PII information, huh?
I do not in my personal Microsoft Gmail account. Now it's signing me out because I clicked sign out. And all this was handled. I didn't code any of that. None of this sign in was me. All I needed to get that sign in to work for that was to install a library, update a few app constants, and click play. Saves a ton of time. Oh, I am still signed in, and I bet I don't have any mail either. Yeah, so since I have not granted this application the ability to read my mail, since I deleted that change, it's not going to let me do that. It's not going to let me sign in to read mail. The application's, doesn't handle that gracefully because it's just an out-of-the-box GitHub application. But it can make that request all at once. Oh, well, there we go. Maybe it will. Oh, there we go. Oh, apparently I shared a old monthly budget in 2016 with someone, and I have that email somewhere. So there we go. Maybe I'm thinking of the wrong permission, but I get that with nothing. Which, to go back to the whole point of this conversation, why choose Microsoft Identity Platform? That's literally all you have to do to be able to access the full power of the Graph API profiles. And that's not even touching on things like built-in support for multi-factor authentication that if you want to set up, passwordless authentication if you want to set that up, as well as being able to manage your applications in my experience. I've looked at others. The easiest application management portal that there is, in addition to managing it with PowerShell and through the Graph API itself. You can use PowerShell to update your authentication and manage all this in your build pipelines in Azure ADO for when you're developing software, so that you don't have to let all your developers into your Azure tenant. They can manage that through PowerShell inside build pipelines. In addition to not being locked down to using Microsoft for authentication, using things like Facebook and Google, so that your customers' users that trust Facebook more than them, or trust Facebook more than Microsoft or Google or whoever, they can choose whatever they want. You're not tied down to using one or the other. You can use all of them. In addition to, if you already have authentication authorization set up, using your own custom identity provider to do that. And then I did mention I was going to show some documentation. Just click on the link.
Well, actually, a quick question for you, Patrick.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, what business cases do you see this being used for?
So where I've used it in the past has been applications where a user with a Microsoft account wants to. Regular app sign-in is definitely one thing. So if you want to sign in with a brand new custom-made application that needs authentication and authorization, Microsoft Identity Platform provides that super easily. It allows you to, web application with different pages. It provides roles for admins and users, super users. You can get down to the page level to the API level and be like, well, they can request things from this API and not this API outside of Graph.
Okay.
So custom APIs can be locked down using this as well. So it's not just the Graph API, it's any API that you want to use what you set up in Azure AD as your source of truth for who can do what where. Microsoft Identity Platform can manage that for you in Azure and in code.
Okay. No, sounds good. Just curious.
Yeah. But all the documentation is out here. It's really easy to read. It's why I, as a developer, like it. I've looked at things. I can't even remember the name. I've looked at using Google to sign into applications before. It's much more difficult to manage on the Google side than it is here. But for example, I mentioned doing it in Google before. Let me see here. The B2C time. Search Google. B2B, that's why. So this is doing the same thing, but to add a Google as an identity provider, this is for guest users, but that's B2C. There we go. This is what I was looking for. I was right. These are all the identity providers. So LinkedIn and Microsoft are pretty tightly coupled now since the acquisition, which I think is great. It's worked real well. But Twitter, Facebook, Google, I don't actually know what that one is. Amazon login, especially helpful if you're doing an application that's a store of some sort. A lot of sellers sell things on Amazon now and manage a lot through there. In addition to things like AWS applications, there's a separate way to authenticate there that they manage that is not as intuitive as the Azure portal, in my opinion. Business and government IDs. So if you have government clients that need login in a new application that you're making, you can use the Azure Active Directory B2C with the Microsoft Identity Platform and manage their credentials that way. And they don't have to change anything from that perspective. That becomes the source of truth for them being who they are and what they can do. And that's just brought into Azure AD, and your application gets the benefit of that. Again, analytics come with that. That's a big thing that every client that I've worked with in my entire career has wanted, is more analytics around who their users are and what they're doing, because that's what's driving businesses these days. And obviously branding, here's all the ways you can sign in. Like I said, you're not tied to a single one. There's Google, Microsoft, and Facebook all right there. Doubt Facebook would like that purple Facebook logo. That's not up to their design standards. They would be upset if you did that. They might blacklist your app. So each of these, there is some setup involved in these applications. You can't just say, yes, sign in with Facebook now, and Microsoft Identity Platform doesn't just do that. There has to be a pre-existing relationship between your Azure AD and the provider. In this, in the case of Facebook, you have to go to Facebook and set up an app and say, allow this app access to these things here. But then once you do that, that can be managed inside the application itself. Went a lot faster than I meant to. Anyone that joined late, any questions? Anyone want me to go through something else again? Anyone that's been here the whole time has any questions? I probably went too fast. Sorry.
So if you got questions, you're on mute. You can feel free to unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand, or feel free to type something in the chat. Patrick, I don't see any questions right now. So again, appreciate your time today, Patrick, and presenting on this awesome topic. Again, for everybody that was on the call, we will have this up shortly for you guys to review the video if you made it in late. Thanks a lot, Patrick. Appreciate your time, and we will see you guys. Let's you guys go a little bit early today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Sounds good. Hey, thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick.